Calvin Reeves was 41 years old, and until that Tuesday evening, he believed his 9-year marriage was simply going through a quiet season. He was an operations manager at a Charlotte logistics firm. Steady, reliable, the kind of man who fixed problems before anyone noticed they existed. That same week, his company had handed him the biggest promotion of his career. Regional Director of Operations, a $34,000 raise, an offer letter he was carrying in his jacket pocket, waiting for the right moment to share with his wife. Instead, Calvin decided to test her first. He told Paula he had been fired. No raise, no title, just gone. What she said next, without hesitation, without flinching, didn't just answer his question. It dismantled 9 years in a single sentence. And in that moment, sitting across from the woman he had built everything for, Calvin looked down at the promotion letter sitting against his chest and made a decision that Paula never saw coming. She had no idea what she had just unleashed. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Calvin sat in his company parking garage, the promotion letter trembling slightly in his hands. Regional Director of Operations. The corner office he'd walked past for 15 years would finally be his. 31 direct reports. A $34,000 raise that would change everything, or should have changed everything. He read the letter again, his eyes lingering on each carefully typed word. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the concrete structure, casting sharp shadows across the dashboard. 11 minutes ticked by on the digital clock before he finally lowered the paper to his lap. It wasn't shock that kept him there, motionless in the driver's seat of his Navy Ford F-150. It was something else. The strange weightlessness of a moment he'd imagined so many times that the reality felt almost unreal. He'd caught every error, solved every crisis, trained every promoted colleague who'd stepped over him on their way up. Now, finally, the reliability had converted to recognition. The letter felt both heavy and impossibly light in his hands. He carefully slid it into the manila folder on the passenger seat, smoothing its edges with deliberate care. Calvin reached for his phone, Paula's number already displayed on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button. Something made him pause, a flicker of hesitation he couldn't quite name. He set the phone back down without calling. The drive home was automatic, muscle memory guiding him through familiar turns while his mind circled the letter's implications. He pulled into the driveway of their 2-story colonial just as the evening was settling in, shadows stretching across their neatly maintained lawn. Inside, he moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Chicken breasts seasoned and into the oven, green beans steaming on the stovetop. Jordan sat at the kitchen table, math worksheet spread before him, pencil tapping against his chin. "Dad, did you know sharks can smell blood from really far away?" Jordan asked, looking up from his homework. "Is that what you're supposed to be working on?" Calvin asked, though he was already smiling. "No, but I read it in my science book, like one tiny drop from a whole mile away." Jordan's eyes were wide with fascination. "That's pretty impressive," Calvin said, checking the chicken. "But let's focus on these fractions first, okay?" They worked through the math problems together, Calvin explaining patiently when Jordan got stuck. The kitchen filled with warm cooking smells and the comfortable rhythm of their evening routine. At 10:15, the front door opened. Paula's laughter preceded her into the house, her attention fixed on her phone screen as she walked in. She was still dressed for her evening out, cream blazer, dark jeans, heels that clicked against the hardwood floors. She pressed a brief kiss to Calvin's cheek as she passed. The kind of kiss you give to familiar furniture, acknowledging its presence without really seeing it. "Good time?" Calvin asked. "Mm-hmm," she replied, already halfway up the stairs. She didn't ask about his day. Calvin watched her go, noticed how she pulled the bedroom door almost closed behind her. Not completely, just enough to muffle her voice when she made certain calls. He'd been tracking this pattern for 3 weeks now. Some calls happened in the kitchen, voice clear and casual. Others triggered this careful retreat upstairs, precise degree of door closure. He looked at his work bag by the front door, knowing the letter sat inside it. The best professional news of his career, still unshared. The promotion letter waited there, like a weight he wasn't ready to lift yet. Later, lying in bed, Calvin stared at the ceiling. Paula's breathing had settled into the even rhythm of sleep beside him. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from his mother, Gloria. "You've been quiet. Something good happening?" Calvin looked at the message for a long moment. Gloria had always been able to read him across any distance. He typed back, "Maybe. I'll call you this week." He set the phone down and turned his head to study Paula's profile in the darkness. The promotion letter sat downstairs in his bag, still unshared, still waiting. The ceiling fan turned lazy circles above them, spinning shadows across the walls. Sleep felt very far away. The house creaked and settled around them, familiar sounds he'd stopped noticing years ago. But tonight, each small noise seemed to carry weight, like the building itself was trying to tell him something. He listened to Paula's steady breathing, to the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs, to the soft whisper of air moving through vents. The promotion letter sat in his bag by the front door, and Calvin lay awake, counting breaths in the dark. 1 week had passed, and Calvin sat at the kitchen table watching Paula move through their evening routine like an actor hitting familiar marks. The closed-door calls had continued, precise retreats upstairs, her voice dropping below clarity each time. She faced away when she spoke to him now, answered his questions a beat too late, as if translating from some other conversation happening in her head. Jordan's bedtime routine had just finished. Teeth brushed, story read, lights out. The house settled into that particular quiet that comes after a child sleeps, when adult truths can finally surface. Calvin studied Paula across the dinner table, noting how she kept her eyes on her plate, fork moving in mechanical precision. She hadn't asked about his work in 3 weeks. The silence between them felt thick enough to cut. "My director called me in today," Calvin said quietly, his voice level and conversational. He watched her face carefully as he continued. "The company is restructuring the regional operations division. My position's been eliminated. 30 days' notice." The lie felt strange in his mouth. The promotion letter sitting in his work bag seemed to pulse with its own gravity. A truth waiting to be told. But he needed this answer first. He needed to see who Paula was when she thought he had nothing left to offer. She set her fork down with deliberate care. Her face showed no shock, no concern, no rush of questions about their $2,340 monthly mortgage. She didn't reach for his hand or ask if he was okay. She didn't mention Jordan's private school tuition, or their health insurance, or their savings. Instead, her expression shifted through a brief calculation. Numbers running behind her eyes, but not the ones he'd expected. "Honestly, Calvin," she said, her voice carrying no particular emotion, "I've been waiting for this. You were never as good as you thought you were." She picked up her fork and returned to eating as if she'd just commented on the weather. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it had 10 seconds ago. The same warm light over the table, the same dishes they'd used for years, the same familiar walls. But something fundamental had altered in the air between them. Calvin felt the shift with the cold clarity of a man whose entire professional life depended on reading what data actually meant. These weren't new words born from shock. They had been stored somewhere in her, pressure built, waiting for permission to breathe. "What do you mean you've been waiting for this?" he asked, his voice remaining steady. Paula shrugged, cutting her chicken into precise squares. The casual dismissal in her movement was somehow worse than any anger could have been. "I just mean, you always acted like you were carrying everything. Like we should all be grateful. I guess now we'll see what that was actually worth." They finished eating in silence. 20 minutes later, Paula excused herself, heading upstairs with that now familiar, almost closed door following in her wake. Calvin cleared the table methodically, washing each dish with careful attention. The routine of it, soap, scrub, rinse, dry, gave his hands something to do while his mind processed what had just happened. The kitchen was spotless by the time he finished, every surface wiped clean, everything in its place. He checked on Jordan, finding him asleep with a book sprawled across his chest. Sharks and other ocean predators. Calvin gently removed the book and set it on the nightstand, tucking the blanket around his son's shoulders. He stood there for a moment, watching Jordan's peaceful breathing, before quietly closing the door. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text from Raymond, Paula's brother, time-stamped 8 minutes ago, while they were still at that table, while Paula was still eating. Heard the news, bro. Damn, that's rough. Calvin read the message 3 times. She had told Raymond. Before the plates were cleared, before the dishes were washed, while the lie was still warm in the air between them, she had reached for her phone and told her brother. He set the phone face down on the counter with careful precision. Walking to his work bag by the front door, he removed the promotion letter. Regional Director of Operations, the corner office, the team of 31, the $34,000 raise that should have changed everything. He read it once, slowly, then folded it and slid it into his jacket's interior pocket, close against his chest. Through the kitchen window, the backyard was dark and still. Calvin stood there, looking out at nothing in particular, while upstairs a door remained almost but not quite closed. The morning sun was barely cresting the horizon when Calvin woke. He moved through the quiet house with practiced efficiency, starting the coffee maker and pulling out ingredients for Jordan's breakfast. Eggs cracked against the bowl's edge, bacon sizzling in the pan. The ordinary rhythm of a morning that felt anything but ordinary. Jordan appeared in the kitchen doorway right on schedule, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Dad, can we have pancakes tomorrow?" "Sure can, buddy." Calvin slid the eggs onto a plate, adding the crispy bacon. "But today it's protein power. Big math test, right?" Jordan nodded, digging in. "Did you know sharks can't stop swimming or they'll die?" "Is that from your ocean book?" "Yeah. They have to keep moving forward." Jordan took another bite. "Like you always say about work stuff." Calvin felt something catch in his throat. He busied himself with cleaning the pan while Jordan finished breakfast. Soon enough, they were at the front door for their morning goodbye ritual. Backpack check, lunch money confirmation, quick hug. "Have a good day, Jordan. I love you." "Love you too, Dad." Calvin watched until Jordan climbed into his friend's mother's car for their carpool. When the car disappeared around the corner, he went back inside. Paula's bedroom door remained closed upstairs. She usually slept until 9 on her work-from-home days. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and opened his laptop. Their joint banking app loaded with familiar blue graphics, cheerfully displaying their combined financial life. Calvin began his review methodically, the same way he analyzed operational data at work, looking for patterns, tracking anomalies, building a clear picture. 20 months of statements. He created a spreadsheet, entering each transaction with meticulous care. The pattern emerged within the first hour. Consistent cash withdrawals, $300 to $500 at a time, always from ATMs outside their usual neighborhood, some at the Whole Foods across town, others near the outlet mall, places Paula frequented but Calvin rarely visited. He totaled the withdrawals, $11,200 from their shared savings, not from her personal account, from the household account he primarily funded. Calvin opened another tab, their joint credit card statement. This was an account Paula managed. He hadn't reviewed it in 14 months because he had trusted her completely with it. He downloaded the statements, scanning line by line. There it was, 11 monthly charges to Charlotte Urban Furnished Rentals, $150 each time. Located in Noida, the city's arts district, full of renovated industrial spaces turned into luxury apartments. Total charges, $12,650. He wrote everything on his legal pad in his precise handwriting. Cash withdrawals, $11,200. Apartment charges, $12,650. Total redirected, $23,750. The sound of movement upstairs made him close the laptop smoothly, without hurry. He refilled his coffee cup as Paula came down, wrapped in her silk robe. "Morning," she said, heading straight for the coffee maker. "Morning," he replied, his voice perfectly normal. "There's cream in the fridge." They moved through their day like actors in a well-rehearsed play. Paula worked from her home office. Calvin attended virtual meetings. They exchanged casual comments about dinner plans. He gave no indication that anything had shifted. After dinner, Calvin told Paula he needed to run to the office to pick up some files. Instead, he drove to Noida, navigating the narrow streets until he found the address from the credit card statement. The Foundry Apartments, a converted textile mill with exposed brick and steel beams. He parked his truck across the street, engine off. The building matched the website photos exactly. Modern industrial architecture wrapped in historic bones. Unit 317, according to the statement detail. And there, in the resident parking lot, Raymond's Audi. The same car Calvin had co-signed for 14 months ago, when Raymond needed help rebuilding his life after his divorce. The same car Raymond had promised would represent his fresh start. Calvin sat in his truck for exactly 11 minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel. He did not get out. He did not walk to the building. He simply confirmed what he needed to know. The address was real. The apartment existed. Raymond's car was there. $23,850 of their household money had built this reality while Calvin wasn't looking. He started his truck and drove home, where Paula would be waiting, where Jordan would need checking on, where everything looked exactly the same as it had yesterday morning. But nothing was the same at all. The next morning, Calvin sat in his parked car outside his office, phone in hand. He scrolled to Derek's number and pressed call before he could overthink it. His cousin picked up on the second ring. "Calvin, everything okay? You never call this early. I need your financial expertise. Got some time? For you? Always. What's going on?" Calvin laid it out systematically, the same way he'd document a system failure at work. The test at dinner. Paula's immediate response. The 20 months of cash withdrawals totaling $11,200. The credit card charges for an apartment he'd never known about, $12,650. Raymond's car in the parking lot. Derek listened without interrupting. The way he approached everything, gathering complete data before forming conclusions. When Calvin finished, the line was quiet for several seconds. The dissipation of joint marital assets is documented and significant, Derek said finally, his voice taking on the precise tone he used for professional assessments. In North Carolina, that's directly relevant to equitable distribution. You need an attorney this week. I can refer you to Patricia Odom. She handled my colleague Mark's high-conflict divorce last year. 22 years of family law experience in Charlotte. Send me her number, Calvin said. Calvin, Derek paused. I've never trusted Paula. Never said it because it wasn't my place. But you need to know. You're not crazy. What you're seeing is real. 3 days later, Calvin sat across from Patricia Odom in her uptown office. She was exactly as Derek had described. Precise, unsentimental, entirely focused on the practical architecture of his situation. She reviewed his documentation carefully, making notes in clean, sharp handwriting. The systematic withdrawal pattern is significant, she said, tapping her pen against the bank statements. Combined with the apartment charges, which she concealed completely, we have a clear case for dissipation of marital assets. The timeline matters. 20 months shows intent and planning. She looked up at Calvin. 3 things need to happen immediately. First, separate your direct deposit into a new personal account. Not joint, just yours. Second, photograph every financial document in your house. Statements, tax returns, investment paperwork, everything. Third, reveal nothing to Paula about what you know. Not yet. We need the legal framework in place first. Calvin nodded. I can do all three tonight. Paula has spin class until 8. Good. Patricia made another note. The co-signed auto loan for Raymond is a marital liability she shares responsibility for. That will matter in the proceedings. Calvin sat forward slightly. There's something else you need to know. Patricia looked up expectantly. I wasn't actually fired. I ran a test to see who she was when she thought I had nothing left to offer. I have a promotion. Regional Director of Operations. $34,000 raise. The paperwork was signed 3 weeks ago. Patricia set her pen down deliberately. She looked at Calvin with something close to professional admiration. So she revealed exactly who she is, while you were holding a $34,000 raise. Yes, Patricia picked her pen back up. Then, we have a great deal to work with. That evening, while Paula was at spin class, Calvin moved through their house with quiet efficiency. He photographed every financial document, downloading the images to a secure cloud drive. He called his HR department and redirected his direct deposit to a new personal account. He made copies of tax returns, investment statements, property records, building the foundation Patricia would need. He was back in his home office, everything in its place, when Paula returned from spin class. She called up the stairs. I picked up Thai food. The usual, okay? Perfect, he called back. Be right down. The next morning, Calvin's company sent the internal announcement. We are pleased to announce the promotion of Calvin Reeves to Regional Director of Operations, effective the 1st of the month. Calvin's 15 years of exceptional service and operational expertise make him the ideal candidate to lead our expanding regional division. His inbox filled immediately. Colleagues he'd trained, managers he'd supported, industry contacts he'd built relationships with over 15 years, all sending congratulations, all expressing how well-deserved this was, all saying they'd known he would reach this level eventually. Calvin sat at his office desk, reading every message. He responded to none of them from home. Each one landed like a quiet confirmation of his value, of his trajectory, of everything Paula had failed to see while she was building her exit with his money. He closed his email and turned to the operational reports waiting on his desk. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and Calvin had never been afraid of that. Calvin sat in his home office, phone in hand. He'd pulled up the Noda apartment complex's number from their website. He took a deep breath, then dialed. Riverview Gardens Apartments. This is Monica speaking. How can I help you? Calvin pitched his voice casual, interested. Hi, Monica. I'm looking at your one-bedroom units. Saw you had some available next month? We do. We have 2 units coming available. Are you familiar with our property? Actually, yes. A friend of mine lives there. Raymond Fox? He mentioned good things about the place. Oh, yes, Mr. Fox. Unit 317. He's been with us almost a year now. Great tenant. Calvin's grip tightened on the phone. That's great to hear. Similar floor plan to what he has would be perfect. They discussed amenities, parking, lease terms. Calvin asked enough questions to seem genuinely interested while confirming what he needed to know. Raymond had been there 11 months. The rent was exactly $1,150 monthly. Everything matched the charges on Calvin's joint credit card statement. After ending the call, Calvin opened his laptop and pulled up his credit monitoring account. He navigated to the detailed report section and began scrolling through 14 months of history. The damage was right there in the data. 5 missed payments on the co-signed Audi loan. Each default had been reported to the credit bureaus. Each notice had been mailed to Calvin's home address. His credit score had dropped 38 points over the past year. The consequences of Raymond's missed payments had been accumulating quietly, while Paula intercepted the notices. protecting her brother's secret at the direct expense of her husband's financial standing. Calvin leaned back in his chair, letting the full weight of it settle. The apartment charges, $12,650. The cash withdrawals, $11,200. The credit score damage from the defaulted car loan. Layer upon layer of betrayal, all documented in clean, irrefutable numbers. He turned to the filing cabinet behind his desk. In the personal documents drawer, beneath tax returns and insurance policies, was a folder labeled Cards and Letters. Calvin pulled it out and began sorting through birthday cards, Father's Day notes from Jordan, anniversary cards from years past. There it was. The card Raymond had given him on his 39th birthday, 2 years ago. Calvin opened it slowly. Raymond's handwriting filled the inside in broad, confident strokes. To my brother. The realest one I know. I wouldn't be standing without you. Calvin stared at those words for a long time. He remembered exactly when Raymond had given him this card. At the family cookout, where Calvin had announced he was co-signing Raymond's car loan. The same cookout where Raymond had made that comment as Calvin walked back onto the patio. Paula deserves a man with real ambition. Calvin had let it go that day. He'd laughed it off, the way he'd laughed off so many things. The comments at family dinners about Paula being too good for a logistics salary. The private texting between Paula and Raymond that Calvin had noticed but dismissed as sibling closeness. The subtle digs about Calvin's career trajectory, always delivered with just enough humor to seem harmless. He pulled out his phone and photographed the card. Then he opened a new document on his laptop and began mapping backward through the past 18 months. Every comment, every text, every moment he'd overlooked came into sharp focus now. Raymond's influence ran through Calvin's marriage like a crack in a foundation wall. Subtle at first, widening over time, ultimately structural. The personal loan Calvin had given Raymond during his divorce, $8,000, 4 months in Calvin's guest room while Raymond got back on his feet. The job referral that had landed Raymond his current consulting position. The co-signed car note that Raymond was now defaulting on while living in an apartment Paula funded with their joint credit card. Calvin closed the laptop. He looked at the birthday card one more time, then placed it carefully back in the folder. There would be no private confrontation with Raymond, no quiet conversation between men, no chance for Raymond to manage the narrative the way he'd been managing it for 18 months. Raymond had done his damage at family tables, in dinners, in conversations, in subtle comments dropped like poison while Calvin was in the other room. He would face his consequences at a family table, in front of their mother Estelle, whose opinion he'd been carefully shaping, in front of Gloria, who had watched it all with a teacher's patience, in front of Derek, who had seen it clearly from the start. Calvin reached for his phone. He had some invitations to make. The following week brought a change in Paula that Calvin noticed immediately. She started cooking dinner more often. Actual meals, not just takeout warmed up. She touched his arm when she passed him in the kitchen. She asked about his day in a voice that carried practiced concern. Calvin recognized the performance for what it was. Paula believed he was financially vulnerable, emotionally destabilized by the job loss she thought was real. This wasn't the return of affection. This was asset management, keeping the resource stable while she determined her timeline. On Tuesday evening, Calvin was heading upstairs to check on Jordan when he passed the master bedroom. Paula's voice drifted through the partially closed door, low and unhurried. I just need a few more weeks. I'm handling the timing. Calvin continued past without breaking his stride, without changing his expression. He helped Jordan with his science homework, read 2 chapters of their current book together, and tucked him in with their usual high-five routine. Everything normal, everything documented. The next morning, Calvin met with Patricia Odom for the 2nd time. He brought a folder containing everything. Bank statements showing the ATM withdrawals, credit card records documenting the apartment charges, loan default notices, Raymond's birthday card, photos of every relevant document in the house. Patricia reviewed it methodically, making notes in her precise handwriting. "Your position is strong," she said, looking up from the papers. "The financial documentation is clear, and the pattern of dissipation is significant. But there's something else we need to establish formally." She pulled out a fresh legal pad. "You mentioned you handle most of Jordan's daily care?" Calvin nodded. "School, drop-off and pick-up, baseball practice, doctor's appointments, homework help. I'm usually the one who's there. We need to document all of that. Courts respond to established patterns of care. Start keeping a formal journal. Dates, times, activities. Everything you do with Jordan. Everything you handle for him." Patricia's pen tapped the pad. "Have you been tracking any of this already?" Calvin reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook. "Informally, for the past few weeks. He'd been noting things as they happened, not from legal strategy, just from the instinct to preserve what mattered." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Good. Make it formal starting tonight. Times, dates, locations. Build the record." That evening, after Jordan was asleep, Calvin sat at his desk with a new journal. He transferred his informal notes into dated entries. Monday, 3:15 p.m. Picked up Jordan from school. Monday, 4:00 p.m. Helped with multiplication homework. Monday, 5:30 p.m. Baseball practice. Worked on his curveball grip. Monday, 7:00 p.m. Made dinner, chicken, broccoli, rice. Monday, 8:30 p.m. Read 2 chapters of Hatchet together before bed. Ordinary love, documented. Every entry a record of presence. Every date and time a proof of who had actually been there. When he finished, Calvin picked up his phone. It was time for the call he'd been postponing. He dialed his mother's number. Gloria answered on the second ring. "Calvin?" "Hi, Mom. Got some time to talk?" "Always for you." "What's happening?" Calvin told her everything. The promotion he'd received 3 weeks ago, the test he'd run at dinner, Paula's immediate response, Raymond's real-time text. He detailed the financial discoveries, the apartment charges, the loan defaults. He described the birthday card, the cookout comments, the architecture of betrayal that Raymond had been quietly constructing for 18 months. Gloria listened in complete silence. From his mother, that silence carried more weight than words. When Calvin finished, she was quiet for another long moment. Then, "Calvin Bernard Reeves, you have been holding up a house that was already walking away from you. Now stop holding it. Let it go and build your own." Calvin absorbed that. "I need you to come to Sunday dinner in 2 weeks, Mom. I've been waiting for you to ask." After hanging up, Calvin made one more call. Estelle Washington answered warmly. She always had genuine affection for her son-in-law. "Miss Estelle," Calvin said, his voice carrying the same warmth it always had. "I'm putting together a family dinner 2 Sundays from now. It would mean a lot to have you there." "Of course, Calvin. I wouldn't miss it for anything." Calvin sat at his home office desk on Tuesday evening, organizing 3 instruments with the same methodical precision he brought to every operational plan. The documentation folder lay open before him, its contents arranged chronologically. 20 months of financial records telling a story in numbers and dates. He lifted his phone and dialed Patricia Odom's number. She answered on the first ring. "Let's review the sequence one final time," Calvin said, his voice steady. "Walk me through what you have in front of you," Patricia replied. Calvin began with the ATM withdrawals, $11,200 systematically removed from their joint savings over 20 months. He confirmed each date, each amount, each location outside their neighborhood. Patricia made quiet sounds of acknowledgement as he proceeded. Next came the credit card statements. 11 months of apartment charges, $1,250 monthly, totaling $12,750. The NODA address was highlighted. Raymond's name was on the lease. "The loan default notices?" Patricia asked. Calvin turned to that section. 5 missed payments on the Audi I co-signed. Default notices sent to my home address. All intercepted. Credit impact documented here. He tapped the credit report showing the steady damage. Total documented dissipation of marital assets? $23,850. Calvin's voice remained level. All verified. All chronological. And the promotion letter? Calvin reached into his jacket's interior pocket and withdrew the letter that had lived there since the night of the test. He had printed a second copy that morning. He placed one inside the documentation folder and returned the other to his jacket, close to his chest where it had stayed for weeks. Both copies printed. One for the folder, one stays with me. Have you prepared what you'll say? Patricia asked. No. Calvin's response was immediate. I don't need to rehearse truth. After hanging up, Calvin sent 3 text messages, brief confirmations for Sunday dinner. Gloria responded immediately. I'll be there at 1. Derek's reply was equally direct. Wouldn't miss it. Estelle's message carried her characteristic warmth. Looking forward to it, Calvin. The instruments were assembled. The witnesses were confirmed. The sequence was set. Calvin moved through the rest of the week with complete normalcy. He handled operations meetings at work, where his new regional director title was starting to feel natural. He helped Jordan with his multiplication table, coached his baseball practice, read chapters of their book before bed. He responded to Paula's performed warmth with his usual steady presence. On Saturday morning, he took Jordan to the park. The air was cool, perfect for baseball. They found an open patch of grass and started throwing, working on Jordan's mechanics. Calvin watched his son's grip, his stance, the way he was learning to follow through. After about 20 minutes, Jordan lowered his glove and looked at his father with that direct gaze children have when they're reading something in the adults they love. Dad, are you okay? You've been kind of quiet. Calvin caught the ball Jordan had just thrown and held it for a moment, considering his son's question. He thought about the documentation folder on his desk, the promotion letter against his chest, the dinner table that waited for tomorrow. He thought about the weight he'd been carrying and the clarity that was coming. I'm better than okay, he said finally. I'm getting clear. Jordan accepted this the way children accept true things from people they trust. He held up his glove. Throw it again? Calvin did. They stayed in the park for another hour, working on Jordan's throw, talking about nothing important, just a father and son on a Saturday morning, the way it had always been. Sunday dawned clear and cool. Calvin woke at 6, made coffee, and began preparing the house with the same careful attention he brought to everything. He wiped down counters, arranged chairs, made sure everything was in its place. Jordan was still sleeping upstairs, and Paula had gone to her early spin class, her Sunday routine. Standing in his kitchen, Calvin felt a deep calm settle over him. The kind of calm that comes from having built something properly, from knowing every component was sound, every sequence was set, every instrument was in place. He did not need to rehearse or review. He was a systems man. The structure would hold. He poured a second cup of coffee and watched the morning light fill his kitchen. His guests would begin arriving in a few hours. Gloria first, then Derek, then Estelle. The promotion letter sat in his jacket pocket, where it had lived since the night of the test. The documentation folder waited in his office, organized and complete. Calvin took another sip of coffee, completely at ease, the most composed he had felt in weeks. The doorbell rang at precisely noon. Calvin opened it to find Estelle Washington on his doorstep, her smile warm and genuine. She pulled him into a quick embrace before Paula appeared behind him. "Mama, you're early!" Paula's voice carried that performed brightness Calvin had come to recognize. She ushered her mother toward the kitchen, where something was already simmering on the stove. "I'm making your chicken recipe." Calvin watched them disappear into the kitchen, noting how naturally Paula shifted into the role of devoted daughter. The sounds of their conversation, Paula's animated questions about Estelle's garden, Estelle's measured responses drifted through the house. At 1 o'clock, the doorbell rang again. Gloria Reeves stood there, straight-backed and clear-eyed like always. She didn't speak immediately. She simply pulled Calvin into an embrace and held him. The kind of hug that carried understanding without requiring words. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were sharp with quiet certainty. "Where do you need me?" she asked simply. "Living room has the best view," Calvin replied. Gloria nodded and took up her position in the armchair that faced both the kitchen and the dining room. She sat with the particular stillness of a woman who had spent 30 years managing classrooms, present, watchful, completely at ease. Derek arrived 15 minutes later, greeting Calvin with their usual understated warmth. He carried a bottle of wine and moved through the house with familiar confidence, setting himself up at the dining room table where he could observe everything without being obvious about it. Jordan bounded down the stairs, baseball glove in hand. "Grandma!" He ran to Gloria, showing her the new leather conditioning he'd done on the pocket. "Dad showed me how to break it in properly." "Did he now?" Gloria's face softened as she examined the glove. "Your father always did know how to take care of things." The doorbell rang a fourth time at 3 o'clock. Calvin knew before he opened it. Raymond. Paula had invited him yesterday, exactly as Calvin had anticipated she would. The pieces were arranging themselves. Raymond filled the doorway with his usual presence. Broad smile, open arms, that particular warmth that had always seemed genuine until Calvin learned to read it properly. He reached for their familiar handshake, the one that had meant safety and history for 2 decades. Calvin took his hand, but instead of the usual quick grip and release, he held it for 1 beat longer than comfortable. His voice dropped low, meant for Raymond alone. "Glad you made it. Don't leave early." Something flickered behind Raymond's eyes. His smile stayed in place, but never quite reached its usual wattage again. They moved to the dining room where Paula had laid out a full spread. Her mother's chicken recipe, 3 sides, fresh rolls, everything arranged with camera-ready precision. The conversation flowed with artificial ease. Paula asked about Estelle's church group. Gloria commented on the weather. Derek discussed a recent golf game. Jordan bounced between adults, showing his baseball glove to anyone who would look. Raymond pushed food around his plate more than he ate it. His usual appetite seemed to have deserted him. Calvin, by contrast, was the most relaxed person at the table, refilling water glasses, asking follow-up questions about Estelle's garden, complimenting Paula's cooking with genuine appreciation. He moved through the meal with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly where everything was going. When Paula brought out dessert, her mother's peach cobbler recipe, Calvin noticed Jordan eyeing the backyard through the window. "You want to go throw that curveball?" Calvin asked his son. "The light's still good." Jordan's face lit up. "Can I?" "Go ahead. Just stay where I can see you from the window." They watched Jordan grab his glove and head out the back door, his excited energy carrying him across the yard. Through the window, they could see him setting up his stance, practicing his grip the way Calvin had taught him. Calvin turned back to the table and folded his hands carefully in front of him. The promotion letter sat in his jacket pocket, exactly where it had been since the night of the test. The documentation folder waited in his office, organized and complete. Every person who needed to be here was seated at this table. He looked at their faces, Gloria's quiet certainty, Derek's steady presence, Estelle's warm attention, Paula's performed ease, Raymond's careful neutrality. The moment had arrived with perfect clarity. "Before we have dessert," Calvin said, his voice calm and measured, "I want to share some things with the people I love most. I need everybody here for this." The table went absolutely still. Calvin reached for the documentation folder with the same measured calm he'd use at any business presentation. No dramatic reveals, no raised voice, just facts laid out in sequence. "I want to start with our household finances," he said. opening the folder and extracting the first set of papers. Through the window behind him, Jordan's shadow moved across the grass as he practiced his pitching stance. Over the past 20 months, there have been consistent withdrawals from our joint savings account, $300 to $500 at a time, always from ATMs outside our neighborhood. He placed the bank statements on the table, each one highlighted with precise yellow lines. The total is $11,200. I have the withdrawal locations and timestamps for every transaction. Estelle's expression began to shift, subtle at first, then more pronounced as understanding took root. Gloria remained perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. Derek watched everything with professional attention. There's also the matter of our joint credit card, Calvin continued, laying out another set of statements. For the past 11 months, there have been monthly charges of $1,150 to a furnished apartment rental company in Noda. Total charges, $12,650. Raymond's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his water glass. Paula's face remained carefully neutral, but her breathing had changed, shorter, more controlled. Combined total redirected from our household without my knowledge, $23,850. Calvin delivered the number with quiet precision. But the money isn't actually the most important part. He reached into the folder and withdrew Raymond's birthday card. The paper was slightly worn at the edges, not from age, but from being handled repeatedly over the past weeks as Calvin studied what gratitude meant to different people. Raymond gave me this card 2 years ago, Calvin said. He opened it and read aloud, "To my brother, the realest one I know. I wouldn't be standing without you." He placed the card in the center of the table. I've been thinking about those words a lot lately, especially after I drove to that Noda apartment address and saw your Audi parked outside. The silence in the room took on weight. Through the window, Jordan's baseball made a soft thump against the wooden fence. Calvin turned to Raymond, his voice level. "How long have you been living in the apartment Paula has been paying for with our joint credit card?" The silence stretched. Raymond opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his sister. Before he could find words, Estelle Washington placed her hand flat on the table. Raymond, just his name, not a question, not even quite a judgment, simply his name, in his mother's voice, carrying the weight of every value she'd tried to instill. Calvin let that moment settle before continuing. 3 weeks ago, I told Paula I'd been fired, that my position was eliminated. It wasn't true. He looked directly at Paula now. It was a test. I needed to see who you were when you thought I had nothing left to offer. He repeated her words exactly, without inflection. Honestly, Calvin, I've been waiting for this. You were never as good as you thought you were. Through the window, Jordan's shadow moved across the grass again. Calvin reached into his jacket's interior pocket, where the letter had lived since the night of the test, and placed it on the table. "Regional Director of Operations," he said quietly. $34,000 raise, effective the 1st of the month. I received this 3 days before you told me I'd never been as good as I thought I was. Paula stared at the promotion letter. Calvin watched her face and saw exactly what he'd been seeing for 9 years, only now he had the clarity to name it. Even in this moment, she wasn't feeling. She was calculating. Running new numbers, adjusting timelines, reconfiguring her exit strategy now that the variables had changed. It was the most clarifying thing Calvin had ever witnessed. Not because it hurt, though it did, bone deep, but because it confirmed with absolute certainty that he had built his entire marriage on a foundation that had never actually existed. Without a word, Estelle Washington rose from her chair. Her face carried the particular weight of a mother who had just witnessed the complete failure of everything she'd tried to teach. She gestured to Raymond. "Outside. Now." Raymond stood slowly, his performance of brotherhood finally abandoned. They walked past the window where Jordan was still throwing his baseball against the fence. completely absorbed in his practice, untouched by the weight of what was happening inside. The back door closed behind them with a soft click. Gloria moved to the chair beside Calvin. She placed her hand over his without speaking. The gesture carried decades of understanding, the quiet language of two people who had always communicated more through presence than words. Paula's face had shifted from calculation to something harder. "You humiliated me in front of my mother." Her voice was tight, controlled, as if she were the one who had been wronged. "You planned this whole thing just to—" "No." Calvin's response was quiet, but absolute. "You told me I was never as good as I thought I was. You texted your brother before you cleared your plate. You took $23,000 from our household and put it in your brother's apartment. I gave you the truth in front of two mothers who love you. Whatever you feel right now, you built it." Through the window, they could see Estelle on the back porch with Raymond. Her voice didn't carry, but her posture did. Straight-backed, unmovable, delivering judgment that had been earned. Raymond's shoulders were hunched, his head down, offering explanations that weren't being accepted. Derek gathered the financial documents with careful precision, returning them to the folder. The promotion letter remained on the table between Calvin and Paula, the physical proof of how completely she had misread both his capacity and his patience. When Estelle came back inside, she came back alone. Raymond did not follow. Through the window, they could see him walking toward his car, his mother's verdict visible in every line of his posture. Jordan waved to him from the yard. Raymond didn't wave back. Estelle stopped at the door and turned to Calvin. The hug she gave him was long and fierce, the embrace of a woman apologizing for what her children had done to a man who had deserved so much better. She whispered something in his ear that made his eyes close briefly. She did not look at Paula. She did not acknowledge Raymond through the window. She walked to her car and drove back to Greensboro. The divorce proceedings moved with the same precision Calvin brought to everything. Patricia Odom presented the documented asset dissipation, $23,850 redirected from the household over 20 months. The court recognized the significance. Paula's settlement expectations collided hard with reality. Raymond's professional reputation didn't survive the exposure. Calvin never had to make a single phone call. The story traveled through their business community on its own power. A man who would do that to someone who co-signed his car, gave him a personal loan, opened his guest room, and handed him a job referral. That story needed no embellishment. The Audi was repossessed when the loan went into complete default. Paula, newly cash-strapped, declined to cover the payments. Raymond moved back to Greensboro, back to Estelle's house. She charged him rent. Calvin bought a house, 4 bedrooms, a yard big enough for baseball, hardwood floors that carried sound in a way that made Jordan's laughter echo. He got primary custody. The promotion that had lived in his jacket pocket now lived in a frame in his home office, not as a monument to the marriage ending, as a reminder of who he had been when no one was looking, and who he had stayed. His first year as regional director exceeded every metric. The promotion that followed surprised no one who had been paying attention. One Saturday morning, early spring, Calvin stood in the backyard watching Jordan practice his curveball. The boy had been working on his grip for weeks, determined to make the ball break exactly right. Calvin recognized that focus, the quiet persistence of showing up every day until something difficult became natural. Jordan wound up and threw. The ball curved perfectly, breaking exactly where it was supposed to. His first clean curve. Jordan spun around with his arms raised in victory, and Calvin laughed, deep and full and completely unguarded, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere below the ribcage. Jordan ran over, and they did their handshake, the elaborate, ridiculous one they'd invented when Jordan was 5, that had grown more complex every year, that belonged only to them. Calvin held on to the last beat a second longer than usual, just feeling grateful. Jordan looked up at him. "Dad, you good?" Calvin looked at his son, at the yard, at the house behind them, the home he had chosen, the life he was building, the morning that belonged entirely to them. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.